Welcome to the Bobby O Show. My name is Bob Potsner. I'm an attorney who has a law firm in Danbury, Connecticut. I live in Richfield, Connecticut. And I'm very pleased to have a guest with me who's the second time she's appeared on my show. She was on show number 75, as a matter of fact. It's Christine Cocchiola, DSW and LCSW, who is an expert in the field of mental health professionals who deal with coercive control. And I thought she was so interesting and had such a great review from other audience people who watch the show. I thought she should come back and explain us some more about her field and also a book she has now written. Christine, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me back, Bobby O.
It's my pleasure to have you back. Since some people, believe it or not, may not have seen that prior show, maybe we should give a little background as to who you are and what you do so we can get into the topic of coercive control.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'm a domestic abuse social justice advocate since the age of 19. My passion was to protect children from child abuse. And that started at a very young age because someone I knew had been abused as a child. And I remember thinking, how could such a horrible problem even exist? And, you know, from there, I volunteered for a local umbrella agency for over 35 years as an on-call person for them. And I also worked in child welfare. I've worked as a CASA volunteer in the court systems and became a therapist, and again worked in child welfare and became a social worker. And when I eventually got into the social work field, I began teaching full-time as a college professor here in the Connecticut University system on all kinds of aspects, including domestic abuse. But here's the funny thing. I didn't know I was a victim myself. And the reason why is because I never suffered physical violence. And the problem is that historically when we think about domestic abuse, domestic violence, this is October, you asked me to come back because it's Domestic Violence Awareness Month. The reality is that we always look through the violent incident model, and not that violence doesn't occur in these situations, but that oftentimes abusers don't show up initially physically aggressive. What they do is they show up using psychological tactics. And when a victim decides to leave, she or he often suffers post-separation abuse, which is the further intensifying of coercive control via legal abuse and the already occurring weaponization of children. My particular niche is how to help children navigate and how to help protective parents help their children navigate these really challenging circumstances. As you know, as a lawyer, oftentimes courts will say to perhaps there's an abusive situation, there will be this idea in the mind of court professionals that that abuse happened 6 months ago, or that abuser abused the primary victim, the adult victim, and that the children are not at risk. And I'm here to say the children are always at risk when they cannot relax and regulate themselves in their own family systems. They're always at risk. And so how do we help provide education to teach people these important concepts, to understand that children aren't safe here, to ensure that we're creating as many safety parameters as possible, but also when that's impossible, either because the court system won't allow it or there's other parameters involved, how do we as protective parents help our children in these situations?
In your prior show, and thank you for that wonderful opening to explain what the story is all about coercive control. But you mentioned in your last show, which I watched again for the 4th time before today, because I wanted to make sure that I was geared up for this, is part of the problem is that women, and it's primarily women who you focused on, and we've talked about the fact that it can be men, and I had a case many years ago where the guy was being abused. But there's an issue of whether people, judges, whoever's involved in cases, friends, family, will believe the victim that they are really being coercively controlled. I think you talked about, by hypothetically speaking, a wonderful guidance counselor or a psychologist or a person who's loved in town, and people say, how can it possibly be that Mr. Smith or Jones or whatever has been victimizing you? Talk a little bit about the fact that victims are often not believed and how that impacts in the ability of the victim to say and come forward to get control of her life.
That's right. So I think it's important, let's define it, right? Coercive control, which is a term propelled by Dr. Evan Stark, who was right here from Connecticut, Woodbridge, Connecticut, is the exertion of power and control over another person. And that goal of the abuser is to diminish the victim's autonomy, to take away their agency, their voice, their ability to really know what they should know. Dr. Stark used an amazing analogy. He said, coercive control is like carpenter ants devouring the foundation of a house. You don't even know it's happening until it's too late. And so if you are someone like me, frankly, very educated in the field, very supposedly adept at helping people navigate their own abusive circumstances, yet I had trouble understanding that the person that I was with was actually exerting this power and control over me. And why? Because I had lost my agency in that relationship. I didn't have a voice. Every time I tried to express myself, I was told I was crazy or too sensitive. I was gaslit. I was manipulated. There was a lot of intimidation. If you leave, you will lose everything, right? Or are you going to really destroy our family system? Or this is going to cost a lot of money if you do that. So there's all of these intimidation factors that do not have to necessarily be bodily intimidation, right? They can be psychological in nature. And so when we have a system that is built on hierarchy, you know this yourself, right? Who has the most power in court systems? Typically, it's lawyers, right? Because they actually have the education, the information to supposedly maneuver all of these situations. And of course, judges. And of course, guardian ad litems and custody evaluators. These are all the people who, just as a result of their positions, have positions of power. And then you take someone who's been broken down over time, has no voice left, wonders if they're crazy, wonders if they maybe should do more. We know this about victim survivors. They rate very high in agreeableness and in conscientiousness. They want the world to work. They want to fix things. They work tirelessly to maneuver and figure out how to make the family system remain in equilibrium, even when there's all of this really significant inequality going on. And so when you go to court and you finally disclose, and the system is like, well, why didn't you come forward sooner? Why didn't you report it to the police? Why didn't you tell DCF, child welfare? And so now all of a sudden, someone who has evidence of abuse is put on the defense. And it's really hard to prove that after the fact. The system doesn't want to believe it after, even if they believe it. They typically don't want to believe it after the fact. So numerous clients I have where a physically violent incident happened 6 months ago, and the court's like, well, that was 6 months ago. The perpetrator has now gone to batter intervention. The perpetrator is working on themselves, getting individual therapy. Even victims advocates will say, he's getting healthy, he's okay. And you know what the number one problem is, I believe? Well, I think there's two major problems. The number one problem is that people don't understand, to your point, that people who have this pathology, they are disordered, and they show up in the most remarkable ways that seem like they're normal. They do not come across as offenders. They do not behave that way in court. They do not behave that way in their jobs. They behave that way behind closed doors.
And that happens when I have a custody case. Unfortunately, there are custody fights, as you know. And let's suppose one parent has never gone to a PPT meeting, that's a special ed meeting for a child, or one parent has never gone to a baseball game that their child was playing in, whatever. All of a sudden, amazingly, the divorce statute gets filed, and guess what happens? The person who has not been involved all of a sudden gets involved. Now, maybe he or she has seen the light. It could be either party, or maybe it's a matter of their lawyer has said, you better do A, B, or C to clean up. You know, the old expression about how you clean up pretty well. Not you always look well, but you know what I'm saying? And how does that, so that sort of shows what you're talking about.
Absolutely. So we know between 75 and 90% of contested custody cases are abuse. I mean, I'll say that again.
Mental or physical.
Coercive control,
Right.
Which is the underpinning of all abuse. Again, abusers don't show up and begin hitting people. Abusers are intent. And so going back to what I said is a number one thing we need people to recognize is the pathology of abusers. Abusers cannot handle the fact that in some way they might be exposed, in some way they might be rejected or abandoned by their partner. And so what they do is they escalate in behavior. And this is when we see, unfortunately, femicide, the murder of women, and filicide, the murder of children. This is why we have the Violence Against Women Act going across the United States as a federal piece of legislation with Caden's Law. Because
I'm sorry, which law?
It's with Caden's Law. It's VAWA, the Violence Against Women's Act, with Caden's Law. It's named after a child, Caden Macaluso, who was murdered in, I'm sorry, not Caden Mancuso, who was murdered in Pennsylvania. And the father actually wrote to the mother that you will never see her again, that you're going to be sorry. There's threats engaged in that. We don't see this very often by women. Women can behave in ways as abusers that are really harmful, of course, and certainly I have many clients who are men and many clients who are gay men who are suffering this abuse by other men. But what I do know is that the impact of this abuse creates a lack of understanding that a perpetrator is really good at hiding who they truly are. They're performative to everyone else in the world. They're even performative to the children. I have many perpetrators who actually did go to all the appointments, who actually did go to all the games, who did do all of those things, but in the meantime, underhandedly, covertly, has been diminishing the relationship between the protective parent and the child, because these abusers know what matters most, more than anything. Oftentimes, certainly the home, or the financial, like they may be dependent upon an abuser financially. We know that 99% of victims suffer financial abuse, but more than that is the weaponization of the children, is having your children actually not know who the safe parent is.
And I actually have a case I brought with me, not my case, that talks about the kinds of abuse that existed. I'll get to that in a moment. But I want to ask you, because part of what you're doing is helping the children get strength. But also there's the victim getting strength. And I've met you May of 2025 at a seminar, and I've seen you a couple times, and we've talked many times. And I don't see you as someone who at age 19 or 29, and now that you're 39, I guess, but I would guess you're right. But seeing you now,
Keep going up.
I know.
Keep going up.
I know, okay. But the thing is that, the point I'm making is that, how did you get out of that cycle? How were you able to say, damn it all, or darn it all, I'm going to get out of this mess? How did you make the realization? Because I'm sure you help your patients deal with things, and when you tell them what I've been through, if you watch Law and Order Special Victims Unit, Benson, the lady, has been raped in the show, and she very often, with the victims, will talk about her rape. And I didn't say you were raped, I'm just saying that happens in Benson. So how did you break out? And the way you broke out might be helpful to the audience and to your clients. You want to talk about that?
Sure. I think, so what's important is that, again, when we are suffering abuse, oftentimes we are what's called trauma bonded to an abuser. We actually, we call it intermittent reinforcement, the moments of good, the hope that things will get better. Victims and survivors, again, highly agreeable and conscientious, they're hopeful that things will get better. And abusers know this. So the character traits of an abuser is, how do I maybe subconsciously create a space where this victim becomes more dependent upon me, where they're actually hoping that things are going to get better. So I can throw them, it's like Biderman's prisoners of war under totalitarian communist regime during the Korean War. What we saw very clearly is that you can give a prisoner a blanket one night, and all of a sudden they're going to befriend the prison guard, because there's a little bit of positive reinforcement. You can give them a piece of bread one day, and the next day give them a half a piece of bread, and they're still going to have the same reaction. We hold on to something. The brain wants you to feel safe, and it feels safer to hold on to what could possibly be good than to recognize that what's going on is really bad. So I could help other people, and I could clearly discern that they were not in healthy relationships, but I couldn't discern it for myself. I couldn't get there myself. And over time, I would have indicators. And certainly, I think for me, what happened was, as soon as I did decide to leave, for probably the 5th time, it takes victims on average 7 attempts to leave. This is probably my 5th time.
You were how old how many years were you married when you left?
It was about 26 years married, and I had known him 7 years before we married. So it was a very long time. And so what your listeners and viewers need to recognize is that abusers attempt to gain control through love bombing, through future faking.
What's love bombing mean?
It's actually considered part of the legislation in the UK criminalizing coercive control. We don't have coercive control criminalized in the United States. In the UK, it is criminalized, and it is actually under their criteria. Love bombing is when you meet someone and all of a sudden it's absolutely so perfect. It's like a love story. It's like you think it's perfect. The person shows up perfect all the time. They act as if you're their soulmate. They act as if they ever lost you, they die. They start future faking you. They start telling you all the wonderful things you're going to have. Yet you maybe haven't met their family yet. Or yet you maybe haven't actually confirmed they actually have a job, right? And so really knowing that abusers use all of these loving type strategies. They might say, please don't go out this Friday night. I just miss you so much. I love you. You've been working so hard. Let me give you a massage. Stay home. And it feels loving, but what it's actually doing is isolating. And so if that is a pattern of behavior, they start with that. Once they have you there, the next phase is to move into maintaining control. And that's where you will start to receive gaslighting, where your reality is kind of shifted. Like they tell you, hey, so you went to the grocery store today, and you're like, how did the person know I went to the grocery store? And then, or, maybe you scroll through their phone, you see another person on their phone, you ask them about it, and they say, what are you doing looking at my phone? Rather than saying, oh, that's a coworker, and probably have too much of a relationship with that person, right?
So if you're still in the early stages or even mid stages of love is blind kind of thing, it doesn't click that, wait a minute, how did he or she know?
You don't want to believe it, because all of the love, the foundational aspects of the relationship that felt really good, your brain likes those parts. The brain is like, oh, this feels really good. I like this. This feels safe. And so for you to make the leap that this is unsafe, there's actual neurological responses in the brain that keep you tethered to those good experiences. So imagine now you have children. Imagine now you have a dynamic of friendships, that you don't want to lose those friendships. Imagine now that, to expose the abuser for who he is means explaining to your children their father is an abuser. Like, could you imagine, right? And so to the point, for me, once I tried to exit, we try to escape. There's never truly escape, especially when there's children, right? But once I tried to escape, it intensified so drastically that there was no way I could deny it anymore.
We're going to get into your book you've written about this in a few moments. The question that hits me is, having gone through, and I'm using you as an example because you're here, but having gone through that bad experience of coercive control, how does a person, you or generally speaking, ever get back on the train again and say, well, maybe I will have another relationship with a person. Maybe I am comfortable to give of my heart, et cetera, et cetera. How does one get back on the train and say, well, I'm going to try again? It must be very hard.
It is. It's a trust issue. It's betrayal. And so what we know is Dr. Jennifer Fried, who came up with the term betrayal trauma, that this is a really, really significant betrayal that people experience because it's with someone you love. And now let's just add the layer that now these children are growing up in a family system where they're betrayed, oftentimes by the abuser, because they know the abuser's love is only given to them if they behave like the abuser wants them to behave.
So that's the children's side, but how about the adult side?
Yeah, so the same idea. It's a betrayal trauma. So it takes a long time to heal from that. I mean, it takes, obviously, ideally, clinical interventions with people like me who really get it and understand the process of healing. It takes time. I think, we often talk about like men are victims too, but they are, but we also live in a world where misogynistic beliefs permeate, right? We do live in a world where even women will take on some of those misogynistic beliefs. That's why I have multiple clients who have female judges. It doesn't matter. If the system is built on these patriarchal norms and the misogyny actually integrates these patriarchal norms, then there's going to be problems with men and women in the system and people who don't identify, obviously, along the binary.
I want to just there's a case, I won't mention the name of the case that was published, and I just want to give you some examples of what this case talked about in terms of abuse. And the decision was a very long decision, but the judge wrote a decision that said, first about verbal abuse. The victim, I'm using the word victim as opposed to the plaintiff or defendant, the victim the abuser subjected the victim to relentless physical abuse. He told her she was too incompetent, too stupid, often the children were present. As a result of the constant abuse, the victim said, I have been conditioned to follow his rules and not challenge his control and authority. At a given time, the abuser is disciplining, punishing, and or berating me about any part of our daily lives that offends him. As a result, over the years, I've learned the way to survive is just to follow his rules with the hope that it might eliminate one or two things he can scream and yell about. Every day for me is just, this is awesome, survival mode. Mm-hmm. Does Christine want to comment upon what I just read to you?
Sure. So I think what people don't realize is that when you're suffering coercive, and everything was described there is all coercive control. So we have a piece of legislation here in the state of Connecticut called Jennifer's Law, right? And Jennifer's Law took Jennifer Doulos' experience and Jennifer Magnano's experience.
Who are those two ladies?
Yeah. So Jennifer Doulos was married by Photos Doulos in New Canaan, Connecticut. And actually she wasn't murdered there, but in any case, she was a mom from that area and she was murdered. And she disappeared, but what we had is he filed 400 pleadings in family court against her. Okay, and then in addition to that, Jennifer Magnano was a mom who left her abuser in the middle of the night with her children, went to shelter in California where I think she had a relative who lived close by and she wanted to go to that shelter, and he called her a kidnapper. And the state of Connecticut police demanded that she come back or she would be arrested for kidnapping. When she came back, he murdered her in front of the children. What I'm suggesting here is that everything you described is coercion and control. The law says that codified coercive control is a form of domestic abuse. I love the law, but it's actually the underpinning of abuse. Every single thing you mentioned, verbal abuse, physical violence, put down, diminishing, legal abuse, financial abuse, psychological tactics to make someone think that they're crazy, that they're not safe. She was living in survival mode. Feminist psychologists in the early 70s, and I talk about this in my TEDx. I'm not sure if you saw my TEDx, but I have over 700K views on it. And every feminist psychologist called this psychological warfare. And it's always about knowing that it will get worse if I try to leave. So to your point about do we believe victims? No, we have tons of research that say that mothers in particular lie a lot about abuse. Not true. That they are disbelieved for their own domestic abuse, even if there's evidence. It's kind of seen as hysteria. And by the way, I don't know if you know, but the word hysteria comes from the Greek word uterus. So
really? I didn't know that.
Yes.
Another thing you taught me. That's yes. Item number 65.
So we have a system built upon thinking that when a mother expresses concerns, that she must be making it up, that she probably doesn't want the father in the children's lives, and that she's probably crazy. And I'm not suggesting that there's none of that, but I'm suggesting the rate of that is extremely low. What we have on the opposite side of that is that we have many men who are predators in these in the relationship dynamics I'm talking about, who are coming off as refined professionals, doing a great job. They're a good father, all of a sudden showing up to soccer games, right? All of a sudden doing what they need to do, or always had done it, but had been diminishing all along. So it's hugely problematic that the system is not looking, going back to my number one and number two, the system is not looking or trying to understand the pathology of abusers. Once you know what these character traits are, once you know them and these people walk in your door, it's not that hard to discern. But we have to have professionals, court professionals, willing to learn that. And frankly, it's a mental health issue. And I don't even like to call it a mental health issue because then it puts like people with depression and schizophrenia and bipolar in the same area. We're talking about character disorders. And I know many judges and lawyers and court professionals like, that's not my job. I understand that, it's not your job, but the problem is they're walking in your door every day. How do we help them understand? They have to want to understand. And what I do know is I recently went and spoke in front of about 500 or 600 judges in Texas and did a 1-hour training, which as you can imagine, I could talk for hours as you know, a 1-hour training to judges. And what was interesting to me is that these judges actually had in their vendors outside of this particular conference. It's the Texas Annual Judicial Education Conference. And they had vendors, and one of the vendors was an agency that provides privacy protection for judges because they are not safe in this world of litigation. Yet we don't have that for victims.
You know, it's interesting because I did a show with a retired federal court judge, Jan Adler. It was done remotely. He's in California and went to law school with me. And he talked a lot about safety of judges and how that's going to negatively impact on the judicial system, or could impact the system. And safety has to be an important part of things, which ties into what I was going to ask you, and that's the following. I thought of you in preparation for this show, but you know, thinking about things you've taught me, and you have taught me a lot, in the Jeffrey Epstein situation. And I'm watching these victims. There were 20 X number of victims who were on TV, and they were complaining about the fact, and rightfully so, that people weren't believing them. And then Mr. Acostas, I will call him a bum, he was the prosecutor in Florida who Trump ultimately gave him the position as a Secretary of Labor or something. And Acosta didn't believe the 20 victims and gave this sweetheart deal. And I'm not meaning to be political here, but it's a fact that Acosta gave a sweetheart deal to Jeffrey Epstein. And I was wondering about the fact that these 20 women who were really knowledgeable and bright 20 years later from when they were abused were not being believed, and it's coming out, and how that's going to impact people like the victims in your coercive control discussions. Gee whiz, if that lady is on national TV and not being believed, maybe I shouldn't come out because they'll believe my husband or wife. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, I think the Sean P. Diddy Combs trial is also an example. So USA Today reached out to me to ask me why they weren't using coercive control in the prosecution, and it's because it's not considered a criminal. It's not criminalized here, and so
it'd be New York. In New York, you know.
It's not criminalized anywhere in the United States. It's codified as a form of domestic abuse now in 9 states. So we still have 41 states that, unless you've suffered physical violence, you can't get a restraining order. It's like very challenging to get a restraining order.
Connecticut has a statute that's a little bit, there's more than just, you can do it with less than physical violence.
Right,
but
well, we've also codified it here too, which is really great. So it's strengthened it for sure. And so if you can prove in other ways, like maybe there was a gun out or bullets or something like that, and prove unsafety, then that's one thing. But overall, physical violence is the determining factor in 41 states right now.
Because it becomes he said, she said.
Right.
But since Attorney Cocchiola, which you're not, but since you mentioned the law, I'm going to go to something, the statute, and I'll ask my director to put on pages 10 of 14, 11 of 14 of the recently adopted, thank you very much, there's something called collaborative law, which we've discussed in this show and other shows, essentially a way to try to get people divorced in a less adversarial arrangement. And there's a national statute, the Uniform Collaborative Law Act, which was recently adopted by the state of Connecticut to codify having collaborative divorces. We've had it informally before, but now it's been codified. And I went to a seminar last week, and I didn't realize this, but the Uniform Collaborative Act has provisions specifically talking about, and I've shown it on the screen, coercive control, and I didn't realize that that was happening. So let's go to section 15A. And it says, prior to the date on which a prospective party signs a collaborative law participation agreement, and that would be between 2 parties and the 2 lawyers, a prospective collaborative lawyer shall, not may, shall make reasonable inquiry whether the prospective party has a history of a coercive or violent relationship with another prospective party. I was pleased to see this language in the statute after you've talked to me about it, about the coercive control, but I wondered, how is a lawyer going to know about this history? What tools? Now, I've gotten tools because of you. Many of my friends don't have the tools in the bar, and I wondered, how are we going to figure out if there has been a history, or maybe my client may be ashamed in that first interview or 7th meeting or whatever to tell me about it. How should we as lawyers help our clients by helping them notify and be aware of the coercive issue in our first or second meeting, so we'll have them open up to us? comment?
I mean, I think it's a wonderful idea. I think not all lawyers are truly, and I don't mean in a bad way, but they're not, it's not their area, right? It's not like they're a domestic violence advocate or a domestic abuse advocate. And of course, they didn't sign up to be that kind of advocate. They signed up to try to litigate or get out of litigation, right? So I think it's a tricky thing. But I do think in an ideal world that they understand that when someone comes in and they start telling them their abuse story, that, you know, of course the first go-to is like, okay, well, what did she do or what did he do to cause it, right? Like we always kind of like are like trying to figure out, is this story true or not true? And I don't think it's hard to discern, again, if I go back to the character traits of abusers. So let's ask the question, why does someone who's worked 80% of the time all of a sudden want 50% custody? Because they don't want to pay child support. Not because they really care about the well-being of the child.
I've had that conversation in my cases as well.
Yeah, and so if I worked in the city 80% of the time and my partner was involved in the child care 80% of the time, and we divorced amicably, it would make perfect psychological sense for the well-being of the child that that partner kept the 80%, because that's who's been the primary caretaker. Yet we strip children away from their primary caretakers just because someone maybe doesn't want to pay child support. So let's ask those kinds of questions. Who was the primary caretaker? Who was the one who was engaged, not just going to games and maybe a coach, that's wonderful, but also making sure that maybe the child had their needs met at school, or maybe was able to ensure that the doctor's appointments were made. Let's also ask the question, who was in charge of bedtime tuck-in? Who was in charge of getting the children off to school in the morning? Not to suggest another parent can't do it, but also understanding that in these relationship dynamics, let's ask, who had more power? If we take the two parents, I call it the parental subsystem, and you take the father and the mother, was one person maybe in charge of all the money, right? Was one person in charge of purchasing cars and taking care of all the finances, and this person was not allowed. It's not that they didn't have access or they didn't care, they weren't allowed. Right? Now the legal system gets involved. And all of a sudden, this person's requiring more and more and more, going back to court again and again and again. And this person is maybe reactive and behaving in a way that, you know, Bob, I know you've seen. You're like, oh my gosh, she needs to calm down. She needs to get herself regulated. But she's been suffering that, what you said, survival for so long.
Sure.
That once she sees him taking more and more and more and more time with the children, not returning the children on time. I have a mom right now in Georgia. The father picked up the child for custodial time, went across state lines, never came back. She has not seen her child in 9 months.
That's a federal law violation.
It is.
By the
Try
way,
finding him.
but let me say this to you. In my opening consultation with my clients, and let's suppose I have, in this case, I'll use the husband as being my client, potential client, and there's a discussion about custody and visitation, that kind of thing. And I have a trick question I always ask. Here's my trick question. Sir, what's the name of your child's second grade teacher? And I would say to you more times than I'd like, because I was 15 years on boards of education, if I get an answer, well, you know, I'm not really sure, I'll say, well, if we're going to go to trial in your case, you better find out the name of the teacher, the best friend, whatever.
That's right.
I belong to CCND, which is Connecticut Council of Non-Adversarial Divorce.
Yeah.
We have a mutual friend, Rosemary Ferranti, who's the president of the organization, and we had a meeting today talking about different issues, and one discussion was about CLEs, continuing legal education, about getting sort of programs, not particularly about this issue, but related issues about getting people to be more aware of different topics, and that's a way to get education. And by the way, I think police officers also need the education, because I'm not criticizing them at all, but if they don't understand, and I've had situations where a lady was being abused and the police officers were kind of like sitting with the husband in that case, and it was difficult.
Well, we can talk about the Gabby Petito case, right? And the idea that Gabby Petito had expressed dysregulation and overwhelm when the police stopped, and he was calm. And he was relaxed and calm. She had the van in her name. He left with the van, and they put her in a hotel. And so she seemed distressed and a little bit emotional, we'll call her, right? And she was also protective of him. She was very much like, I don't want to get him in trouble. I'm worried about him. I want to do the right thing.
I'm worried about his going back to work, so I'll have money for the food on the table.
Yeah, right. And so really being able to look at these more in a broader lens so that we can say, okay, what's really going on here? And again, lawyers don't go to school to do this. Let's be clear. Lawyers don't even have to take a course in domestic abuse. So I'm not in any way trying to say this is a lawyer's fault, but there's some shifts that have to happen. We need family court professionals to actually care. And it's interesting because for me, I took the guardian ad litem training here in the state of Connecticut just for intel.
And just for the audience, the GAL training is that if you're a GAL, you act for the best interests of the minor child, and it doesn't have to be a lawyer appointed, though it typically is. Mental health professionals, in many cases, can be the GAL. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, thank you. Thank you for that explanation. But what's interesting to me is that it seems like if I have a bias to protect children, then I am not as welcome in the family court system, because my bias is we do not look towards the children and their best interests. We look towards equality. That's part of the problem in the family court system. How do we get everybody kind of, maybe not happy, probably everybody equally unhappy? How's that for a word, right?
Christine, if you're deemed to be biased, keep up the bias.
Yeah.
I want to say to you that you talked about lawyers are not trained in certain areas. I had a case many, many years ago in which there was a multiple personality issue. And I had the husband and the ex-wife had multiple personalities. Now, DSM-5, which is the book that it's our Bible to see what the mental health issues are all about, there's some dispute as to whether or not there is such a thing as multiple personalities. But what I did for that case, you might give me a star for this one. I went to a 2-day seminar with, it was like 12 or 13 psychiatrists and Bobby O. And I learned for 2 days about multiple personalities.
Nice.
And the Sybil, the Sybil thing. And what I learned, in fact, I was in my office recently to find some old papers. I found a book from like 20 years ago about multiple personalities. So lawyers can get off their tuchuses and go to seminars. And I learned a lot. And in fact, it was like, hey, we got a lawyer here in the audience today. And I learned a great deal about it, and it helped the clients deal with different issues. So we as lawyers, can do.
Yeah, no, you're very open to learning. That's pretty evident. And if we just had more of that, and I think, so multiple personality disorder is now called dissociative identity disorder now.
Thank you for correcting me.
Yeah,
I appreciate it.
well, you took the training 20 years ago. Since then, we've had a new DSM-5 that they've come out with and supposedly cleaned up a lot of things. But I think, in general, the problem is that most of the people that we are seeing in these abusive situations actually have traits that line up with the behaviors of narcissism, Machiavellianism, psychopathy.
What's psychopathy?
And sadism. So narcissism is the typical grandiosity or self-absorbed lack of empathy, and a lot of people have an error. They think that people who are narcissists don't have any empathy. That's incorrect. They actually have something called cognitive empathy, which is intellectual empathy. I have the ability to see where you are, figure out how to navigate this, and create a space where you see and feel like I'm empathizing with you. I can go to funerals, you can have a loss, and I can behave cognitively. But I do not have something called affective empathy, which is really this ability to sit in your shoes as you, to truly feel your pain. I have a barrier to feeling your pain. So that would be kind of those traits in narcissism. Then Machiavellianism is the ability to manipulate very well, and they learn to manipulate systems very well. Family court systems, criminal justice systems. We see these people in our criminal justice system all the time, right? And then psychopathy, which is I'm willing to break the law, or I already am. Stalking is illegal in all 50 states. Every one of my clients is being stalked. So there is guess what, I'm going to get away with it. There is an emboldening that happens in family court. The abuser who never had an interest in the children, to your example, and now gets 50-50 so they don't have to pay child support. And what really the mother wants, of course, more than the child support we would assume, is just her children, the time with her children that she had always had. So she goes from 80 to 90% of time to 50%, and she's brokenhearted. And so the abuser gets emboldened because the court system doesn't even take that into account. So there's this idea of being able to be above the law.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing about that. And one of the problems, and then we're going to shift gears because we're going to have a third show. With your schedule, I'm going to plan it now for 2026 and 27 because it's hard to get a hold of you. But the one problem we have is that if I have a case, I deal with that case for when it's filed to when it's ending.
Yeah.
And if it's going to be one that's going to be a case in which there's going to be a trial situation, we're living that case as the lawyer, the client, the GAL, the other experts,
Absolutely.
whatever. The judge has a limited time, a period of time,
100%.
and unfortunately, the courts and the judges do the best they can. And there's some wonderful judges we have in the state of Connecticut, which is where I primarily practice. But they don't have enough time. In fact, I have never had a trial in which there weren't at least 5 interruptions per day, not because the judges wanted to do that. So part of the problem is our underfunding, shall we say, of the court
100%.
process. Now I'm going to jump because I've got a lot more questions for you.
Can I just give you the fourth part of the dark tetrad? Because I said narcissism, Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and sadism. And what I see with many of my clients is that these people with these I call them characterologically disordered people, they actually enjoy the process of making sure the other person experiences pain. They want the other person to suffer. And this is what I see in all of my cases. I'm glad you don't see them in all of your cases, but this is what I see in all of my cases.
Well, you know, and I'll tell you, not to be political again, but a lot of reports are that our President of the United States is enjoying hurting people. We'll get to that. I have that on my list of questions for today, but I want to jump to something because we don't have, unless I want to treat you to dinner for the next 2 hours, I want to get to your book, and then we'll come back to certain topics.
Sure.
Sitting in front of me, I don't know if you can see it on the screen, is the book, maybe I should hold it up.
Every Moment of Every Day.
Every Moment of Every Day, and that's right in front of me, written by Christine, and it hasn't come out yet, but I've gotten a cheat sheet, and she did promise me, it's on the record now, there's your book right there, it's on the record now that I'm going to get an autographed copy of the book for you.
Sure.
But tell me why it is that, first of all, that you wrote this book called Every Moment of Every Day. Tell me why you wrote that.
Sure, and I want to go back to the first book I published, which is called Framed, Women in the Family Court Underworld. And it is a compilation of 22 case studies of women who suffered family court atrocities. And I came up with the idea in April of 2022 because there's just so many of my clients who are experiencing this that I asked people to start sending me their stories and began editing them, and then my co-author and I put together this book in about 8 months. So it ranked very well on Amazon under self-help abuse and family law. It ranked very well on Amazon. So yeah, this summer I worked.
So hold it. So if I'm really nice to you, I might get that book autographed as well.
Yes, absolutely. I think I'm going to have to do that.
Okay.
So Every Moment of Every Day is a story about a little boy and a little girl who have to go off to the home of someone they don't want to go to. They don't want to go to their parents' house. They want to stay home with their mommy. It is a story for protective mothers primarily, and it is a story that is about a child who doesn't want to go to custodial time, but integrates clinical interventions, which when we're dysregulated and we don't want to do something, or when we're coming back from someone's house and we've had a time where maybe the abuser has coerced the child to say, you don't love your mommy, do you? Or you don't really want to go home to mommies, do you? When that kind of behavior happens, no one actually sees that as an unacknowledged child abuse. It is impacting the developing brain. And thankfully, children are very resilient, but protective parents are the primary influence for their children. They can heal their children. It takes a lot of work. This is not a marathon, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And in the book, I give you ways to help your child regulate when they have to go and when they're returning, so that they draw closer towards connection, as I say there in the last sentence, because from the ability for a child to be authentic and in knowing they are loved unconditionally, secure attachment blossoms. And the way that we can really help raise healthy, resilient, ego-enhanced children who feel good about themselves, who value themselves in the world, who do not have a greater likelihood to be in an abusive relationship or to take on traits of abusers, is to create secure attachment with a safe, protective parent.
What is, you used the word a couple times, dysregulation, I think is the word you used. What does dysregulation mean in the context of what you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, we can give the example of when, the time that you were driving maybe a few weeks ago and somebody ran through a stop sign, and in that moment you got probably angry because your car almost got hit maybe, right? those are called, that's our reptilian part of our brain actually reacting. And so children, when they have been coerced, just like the adult victim, when adult victims go into court, sometimes they behave in an emotional way. They don't regulate their behaviors. They get out of sync, right? The brain is like having a hard time finding like that safe, secure spot, especially if their abuser's 2 feet from them or 10 feet from them, especially if the judge is attacking them, they're feeling overwhelmed. Children are having the same experience. They're going to an abuser's house. They're being often conditioned to feel a certain way about unsafe with the abuser, even if they don't behave unsafely. It's this knowing that if I don't do exactly what he or she wants, they're going to be mad at me. If I don't say what they want me to say, they're going to be mad at me. They're going to pull love from me. I can't feel safe with them. And then what abusers do is oftentimes condition the child to feel the same way about the safe parent.
Is this book written for the child to be read to by the parent?
It is.
Or is it, okay, or I was going to say, or is it written for the parent to smarten up?
It's a both. Both. It's
Two for the
giving
price of one.
parents, it's giving the parents the skill set they need, and it's intended for the parent to read to the child.
You know, it's interesting. I have a 3.5-year-old grandson, as you know, because I spoke to you the other day from the playground. If he falls down, and he'll say, and he calls me Bobby, okay? He calls me Bobby. And he'll say, kiss my boo-boo. But if you have a mental health problem, and you said don't use the word mental health, but if you have a situation where a child is being abused in the way you say, you can't just kiss the boo-boo.
No.
You know, and so how do parents, if you're the abused parent, for example, how do you, and I presume the book deals with this a little bit, how do you help your child feel safe, as safe from the cut boo-boo to the mental health boo-boo?
Right. So one of the things we know about trauma is not what happens to me. Trauma is the response that I get from others after experiencing it. So to the point about your little guy, your grandson, right? When he falls and someone says, oh, stop it, you're fine. Get up, you're fine. Or he gets, oh my gosh, come on over here, let me kiss that for you. Let me give you a hug, are you okay? Do you see, one creates trauma, the other actually annihilates trauma, which is what we need. So when your child is coming home really dysregulated and overwhelmed, and you are not recognizing, this is important, protective parents need to recognize that just like the abuser diminished you over time, they're doing the same thing with the children. The courts don't recognize this. Many therapists don't get this. I'm trying to train therapists to get this. Therapists will gaslight children into saying, oh, daddy loves you so much, or oh, mommy loves you so much, when actually that parent is conditioning the child to feel unsafe. So if we can be there to greet them, now to your point, we're trauma victims. There's nothing like your child coming home and calling you a stupid B word. I mean, I'm talking to adolescents who get really dysregulated, right? And they're getting all the things they want. They have no curfew, they can stay online as long as they want, they have their phones, and then they come home to you and you have structure, right? So they're really dysregulated. In your mind, you're like, this kid is treating me just like he did or she did, like, oh my gosh. What I want you to realize is that your child is like a prisoner of war. They are coming home as soldiers. They are required to do this. They are suffering the same things you did. And if you can kind of take that 10,000-foot view and say, oh, I know exactly what that is. I know why it's happening. I know who did it to them. I can see their dysregulation. They're experiencing it just like I did. And now you be present in that. And so moms will say to me often, and dads, but I'm so upset. And I'm like, but if you don't tell your brain that your brain is safe in that moment, not unsafe, because that brings up a feeling of unsafety. If you don't tell your brain you're safe, your brain will never know you're safe. We have to teach, it's called, for therapists, it's called cognitive behavioral therapy. We actually have to change our thought process so that our behavior aligns with it. And if we keep thinking every time our kid comes home we're unsafe, and I'm mad, and I can't believe they called me that, or they won't listen to me, or they won't follow the rules, and all these things, your life is chaos and unsafe. If you actually recognize the abuse they're experiencing, that will change it all for you.
You know, I'm smiling because the day I spoke to you from the playground, there was another little boy who was a year older, so maybe 4.5 years old, whatever, who was being mean to some of the kids, and my little guy said, hey, take a deep breath.
I love it.
And I'm thinking, wait a minute, where he must have heard
Mama
whatever,
and Dada.
take a deep breath. And it's funny because it's almost like in this situation, if a parent's being out of control, whatever, can you see a 3.5-year-old kid saying, hey, daddy or mommy, take a deep breath. And
Right.
I couldn't help but laughing. I almost called you, but I didn't want to.
That's a good one. That is a good one.
Are there any, we only have like 5 minutes left in this show, so we're going to have probably 3 more shows. Okay, you'll come down more often. I'll buy you dinner or something. Okay, here's what I want to ask you. Are there any particular pages, or put it this way, having read the opening salvo, are there any pages that you want to refer to from your book, or any comments you want in the book that you think are particularly pithy for now?
Sure.
Do you want me to
So
hand
what
you a
I would
copy of
say
the book, or?
is the book is about the child knowing that every moment of every day, that protective parent is right there waiting for them in a calm, regulated way. And then when they come home, I give protective parents a few little strategies. What we know, the way that children heal from challenging circumstances, and remember, behavior is an expression of how I feel. So if I'm behaving in a way that's erratic or overwhelmed or maybe angry as a child, having a temper tantrum, that's really my expression of feelings that I can't communicate well, right? And so we know that things should be rhythmic. Rhythmic helps the brain heal. So whether it's jumping down, up and down on a trampoline or throwing a ball or dancing, right? We know that things should be repetitive, that the more that we can repeat these things, so it's not just throwing the ball once, it's maybe throwing the ball for like 30 minutes. The brain can start to calm. We also know these things must be relational. They must feel like it's a true connection. And this means being ready when your children come home for what they need. In the book, I talk about mom will be here waiting for you. We can talk if you'd like, or we can just sit here quietly. You know, in other words, there's no pushing or tell me how it went. How was your time at your father's or your mother's? It's just being. It's called co-regulation. If I sit in a space of being regulated, my child will sit in a space of being regulated. Tricky part. If your child's been very dysregulated numerous times, and every time they've been dysregulated, you've responded, you've reacted in a dysregulated state. Stop it. You need to stop. You need to behave. You need to do this, right? Okay? It's going to take longer for them to learn the new skill set and to learn the new you.
We only have a few minutes left. The time has gone by so quickly. I don't want to forget. Would you please slowly twice tell us the website people can go to learn more about this book and what you do in this topic of coercive control. So let's do that.
Sure.
So I don't want to forget it.
My website is Coercive Control Consulting, and also you can go to iknowyourheart.com because that's an easier name to remember, iknowyourheart.com. I'm on Instagram and Facebook and LinkedIn and everywhere as Dr. Cocchiola, typically at Coercive Control or _ Coercive Control, but you can typically find me at COCC. Dr. C is what people call me. And I have a protective parenting program that specifically teaches protective parents all of these strategies. And as you know, I'm training professionals. I really want professionals to understand what's walking through their door. And an hour is not enough time to teach it, but it's at least something. There's starting to be more and more education about this, which is fantastic. And I'm really grateful. And I'm grateful for all that you do and appreciative of you inviting me back.
Do I get a little star for this?
Yes, you do.
It's really important what you do and what you've said, and I've taken it seriously in terms of what, obviously I prepared, and I found that case that I was talking about, and it's important to spread the word, and it's important that people understand that this is going to impact not only the current generation, but the kids' generation down the road. And I am very worried, and I've had a lot of shows to do about politics, and this is not that show, but I'm worried about a lot of things in our country, but the fact that we're seeing such dictatorial activities, kids getting separated, kids seeing their mommy or daddy and forget whether or not they're legal, illegal, green cards, whatever. If a little 5-year-old kid or my little 3.5-year-old grandson all of a sudden saw someone come and take me away for no reason, that heartbreaking, and that child is never going to forget. That's why I asked you before about how can people who have been through what you've been through ever trust another man or a person to be close to, because you know, it's a burn me once, shame on you, burn me twice, shame on me.
Yeah.
And it's really a very hard thing to overcome. I want to thank you so very much. I think we're almost friends or more, you know. And I really appreciate what you've done to help educate me, help educate the community. And thank you very much for coming down. It was a long ride for you, and you got stuck on 84 a little bit.
It's all good.
So Christina, thank you
you
so very much. I'm sorry we didn't hit all the topics I wanted to get to, but we got a lot done today.
We did.
So this has been Bob Potzner with the wonderful Christine Cocchiola, whatever it is. I screwed up your name again, Cocchiola. And I want to thank you very much for coming down again. This has been the Bobby O Show, Bob Potzner. Thank you all for watching. And please listen, not to what I said today, to what Christine said today, because she has a lot of good messages for you, your children, and the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you.